Hello and welcome back to My Hope, the video series that seeks to explore biblical reasons for hope in our own day. Welcome to Season 2, which begins with this video. We've entered the season of Lent, and I thought that during Lent we might reflect together on communion, on some of the meanings of communion and how they can give us hope. So today we're going to think about Jesus as the bread of life. We obviously take bread when we take communion, and one of the things we say, at least in some of our traditions, are the words "feed on him in your hearts through faith." So I want to explore just for a minute or two some of what that means and how that can give us hope. Now, there are a number of wonderful themes from the Old Testament which find their landing point at this moment where Jesus gives bread to his disciples and invites them to eat and then to drink together. We'll be exploring some of these over the next few weeks. But with regard to bread in particular, there are two that I want to pull out today. And they relate not only to the Last Supper accounts in Matthew, Mark and Luke, but also to the fourth Gospel and to what we call the Bread of Life discourse. We'll come to it in a minute, where Jesus speaks about himself as the bread of life. John doesn't have an account of the Last Supper, at least not the communion element of the Last Supper. But this Bread of Life discourse is exploring some of these themes. And as always in John's Gospel, he does it so richly. So here's the first theme that lands in that place. And it's a little known verse, really. It's from Deuteronomy 16. So in Deuteronomy, the people who are about to enter the promised land, it's the second generation after the generation that came out from Egypt as slaves. This is obviously a long, long while before Jesus had eaten the Last Supper with his friends. In Deuteronomy, this second generation is being reminded of the story so far, being reminded of the covenant that God made with their parents, but therefore with them as well. And Moses is giving them some instructions about how they're to live when they enter the land. And we read these words in Deuteronomy 16. "You shall offer the Passover sacrifice to the Lord your God from the flock and the herd at the place that the Lord will choose as a dwelling for his name. You must not eat with it anything leavened," that means anything with yeast in. "For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread with it, the bread of affliction, because you came out of the land of Egypt in great haste, so that all the days of your life you may remember the day of your departure from the land of Egypt." So Moses is giving instructions about how the people are to remember that wonderful moment when they, their ancestors, but they, the nation, were delivered from Egypt. And they do that every year by celebrating the Passover meal. We're going to talk about the Passover more in a future video in this particular Exploring Communion season. So I don't want to go too far into that today. But I want us to notice that language of the bread of affliction, because the unleavened bread which is eaten at Passover, at least as Moses describes it here, is described as the bread of affliction. It's a bread that reminds them of their slavery. They're going to eat bitter herbs with it as well. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. We must look at this in a week or two. But this bread which they eat is described as the bread of affliction. The Passover meal is a meal of rescue. Now, I think that language of bread of affliction invites us to meditate on what Jesus is saying when he describes himself as the bread of life, and when he gives bread to his friends to eat and tells them this is the new covenant. Because I think here he is transforming that bread of affliction. He's offering them bread that is the bread of life, no longer the bread of sorrow, no longer the bread of captivity and slavery, or even the bread that is intended to remind them of captivity and slavery, but the bread that looks ahead, the bread that is the bread of life. So it's worth having that little known verse in Deuteronomy in our minds, perhaps, as we eat and drink next time we take communion together, remembering that this is not the bread of affliction that we are eating. But the second great theme that lands into the New Testament here is the theme of manna. So you probably remember that after the people of Israel were brought out of Egypt, they're brought into the desert, and they spend a long while in the desert. And it'll be obvious, I'm sure, that the desert is not a place that will readily feed a large crowd of people. There's not much in terms of grazing for your crops. There's not much water. There's very little to eat and drink. And God provides for his people in those years by giving them something called manna. I'm going to read to you now from Exodus 16, and we read these words. When the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a fine flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" And the Hebrew for "what is it" is manhu. And that's how it gets its name. For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat." So manna was God's food for his people. It was food for the journey. These are people who have been saved. They've been brought out of Egypt, and they need sustaining in their long walk. And the manna is what is going to sustain them. This is a saved people being sustained. This is God's food for God's people. Now, there's something unusual about the manna, and that was that it didn't keep. I suppose in some sense that doesn't sound that unusual. They didn't have fridges in those days, and we know that food goes off quite quickly without a fridge. But the manna would not keep it even until the next day. If they kept it till the next day and tried to hoard it, then they would find it was full of worms. And this was something that encouraged them to seek their bread daily, to trust in God every day, not to store it up because God might let you down tomorrow. But they had to trust, come with open hands, as it were, every day, expecting him to provide, except the Sabbath. The Sabbath was a particular instance, and then they harvested twice on the day before so that they could be fed on the Sabbath without having to do the work of harvesting. But this was daily bread. Where have we heard that before? So let me turn now to John 6. Now in John 6, we begin by reading the account of the feeding of the 5,000. It's a story that all four Gospels give us. When they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, "Rabbi, when did you come here?" Jesus answered them, "Very truly I tell you, you are looking for me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves." So Jesus says, you've got full stomachs, and you're looking for me because you've got full stomachs. But that feeding was a sign. It was a sign of something much greater. And you're not chasing after me because of the sign. You're not chasing after me because you want to understand what that's about. And then he says this, "Do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures for eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you." Do not work for the food that perishes. This is a reminder of the story of the people being fed in the desert with manna, which perishes the next day, which is rancid the next day. Jesus has just fed a large crowd of people in the desert. And he says, it's not like manna. The bread I give is not like manna. It's bread in the desert. It's the food of God for the people of God. But it's better than that, because the bread I give, the bread of life, he's going to go on to say, is bread that does not perish but endures for eternal life. And so they go on to say to him, and this is not his disciples, I think this is some of his sceptical followers, and they say this, "What sign are you going to give us then, that we may see it and believe you? What work are you performing? Our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness. As it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat." It's a blinking cheek asking such a question. What sign are you going to give us when they have just been fed miraculously in the desert? And Jesus is very patient with them and says, "Very truly I tell you, it wasn't Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but it's my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is that which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." Now we, probably, if we've read the Gospels a few times, if we've been sitting in church for a while, we probably get this. We probably understand that Jesus is talking about himself, but that's the secret that we know and the gospel writer knows, but his listeners don't know yet. And so they say to him, give us this bread always. And they're thinking about physical bread still. And Jesus says to them, it's like the mic drop moment, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. Jesus is the bread of life. When we take communion, we feed on him in our hearts by faith. This is the food of God for the people of God. This is food for the journey. This is our daily sustenance. We mustn't try and store it up. We must feed on him daily in our hearts. And when we take communion, we can remind ourselves of these things. We can do that feeding on him in our hearts through faith. And for this reason, we can have hope.